All right, you are tuned in to Fish On, the webcast where we talk everything fishing. Today I've got two guests that I'm excited to bring on the show because we're going to talk about basically everything striped bass. I thought I'd bring them on because I've been on the river a lot this year, more so than other years. And, generally I'm just kind of out there fishing and doing my thing, trying to catch striped bass. But this year I really kind of tried to learn as much as I could about them. I figured if I'm going to be on the river that much, it'd be a good idea to kind of figure out like these fish that I'm targeting so much. Where do they come from? What are their spawning habits? Everything I could kind of learn about them. So I'm excited to have two guests on the show that are going to help me out with that. One is Owen Marr, who is just a legend of the Stewiacke. I remember even before I kind of really knew about striped bass and Stewiacke, back when there was the fishing forum, NovaScotiaFishing.com. I remember, looking up striped bass, trying to get information. It's hard to find information in Nova Scotia about fishing, but his name always popped up. And I always thought, where's this guy catching these fish? I gotta figure this out. So he's just a wealth of knowledge, probably knows the most about striped bass of anyone that I know, especially in the Stewiacke River. My other guest is Lita O'Halloran. She's a member of the striped bass research team, and she does all kinds of cool studies with tagging and all that stuff, all the stuff that I don't really know about. So I really want her to come on and kind of tell us all about that. So I'm really interested and really excited to have them on because, part of fishing and angling is not just to catch fish, but it's to kind of learn about it and kind of learn how to, be conservationists and how to help these species. And we have a world-class fishery here. A lot of people don't really get it if you're not into fishing. It's crazy here, and we need to build as much knowledge as we can about these fish. So I'm going to stop rambling. I'm going to let them talk about it all because they know way more than me. I can catch the fish. They know the ins and outs of them. So, and Lita, hey guys, thanks for coming on. Appreciate it. It was a little bit short notice, but we got things together, and I'm so happy you're here. So what I always do is kind of get my guests to kind of give a little intro to themselves, and if they fish, when they started fishing, their earliest memory. So why don't we go with Owen first? If you want to give a little short introduction to yourself and some things you do, and maybe talk about a little bit how you got into fishing and so forth.
Oh, thank you, Matt. My name's Owen Marr. I'm a member of Sipinaki First Nation. Currently sitting as the president of the Striped Bass Association. We've been in association has been there for the past 10 years. It's been in with the striped bass research team, doing a lot of presentations for us, and worked closely with a lot of us within the association. But I've been fishing these for basically my whole life. I can remember being 5-6 years old, going down with my parents and some of the elders from our reserve, and that's where I learned a lot of information by listening to their stories and taking those stories and applying them every time I go out. And it's our culture. We learn by telling stories, and it's something that I continue to do. And it's wonderful. But once you take their knowledge and you've tried to figure out the ins and outs, and to me, the learning curve is still ongoing. And it's one of those things that you never start learning about the fish. I mean, from my perspective, that I'm not the science behind it, but I do take the knowledge that's apply it the best I can, and I hope to pass that knowledge on to others, whether they be native or non-native, young, old, new fishers, old fishers, people of different genres, fly fishermen, spin cast, bait cast. You'd be surprised how many people are willing to take that knowledge and apply it to their techniques. So
I agree, and I think that's really important. As a fishing community, to kind of pass on knowledge to other anglers. We want anglers to be successful, and passing on that knowledge can help with protecting species and better fish handling skills and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I know exactly what you're saying, and I appreciate that.
And
and
that's how I got involved with the striped bass research team through Nova Scotia Fishing. Like you said, I was always posting information on there, basically tide times and how to fish, and basically what works and what doesn't work. And I found at the time there was very little knowledge, like you said, out there, and people just wanted the information. They wanted the information. They would tune in, and then all of a sudden it started growing by leaps and bounds. And then a friend of mine, as a former KDS student, Jeremy Broom, talked to me, asked me about these fish. He said, well, your name comes up. Let's work on something. So we ended up working on a project with him. Lita's probably aware of a little bit of it. And then that just progressed right into the striped bass research team after that project he was done. And then it's been, 5-6 years now?
Quite some time,
yeah. So, yeah. And like I said, and it's a wealth of knowledge, and the knowledge goes both ways. Not only does it, we teach them, they teach us, and then we in turn teach the fishermen, which is really great circle because it's always constant learning.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
Before we
move on to Lita's introduction, I just want to. Justin Paul says, Owen, he's the best striper fisherman in the province. That was his comment. So.
I wouldn't say I'm the best, but I'm up there. I fish with Justin on a regular basis, and he can handle his own. So.
Perfect. All right, Lita, tell us about yourself. What is it you do, and do you do any fishing yourself?
Yeah, so Lita O'Halloran here with the striped bass research team, which is kind of a group based out of Acadia University. I grew up doing some fishing, mostly just, freshwater bass, and, love being outdoors. So I actually, before moving out east, went to school to learn all about the environment and how to manage ecosystems and how everything all interacts in sort of a big picture kind of standpoint. And you guys will appreciate this. One of my first memories moving out east, I walked out, in Wolfville in the valley there and in Nova Scotia, and was admiring the tides, and there was a local there. So I said, had grown up in Ontario, not knowing what fish were in the ocean. I said, hey, what kind of fish can I catch around here? And he's like, well, it ended up being my neighbor, and just by chance. And he's like, well, come out here tomorrow, 2:00. I'll take you out in the boat and I'll show you. And so that was like one of my first week in Nova Scotia. Ran into a stranger, asked what kind of fish there was, and he took me out fishing. So, awesome experience going from Ontario to the East Coast. I'm in New Brunswick now. But yeah, so with the striped bass research team for about 5 years, working specifically on striped bass. Our group does work on other species as well. But my focus is, we'll get into a little bit later, I'm sure, but mostly on tagging and sort of big picture pieces about striped bass and taking citizen science and information and trying to answer questions about them that, there's so many unknowns about them in the Bay of Fundy, just trying to answer them.
Yeah, that's really cool. So we're definitely going to talk about some of the research you guys are doing and some of the information maybe that you've come up with. So I guess the first thing I kind of want to ask is, tell me a little bit about kind of like what projects are ongoing right now, or any that have been kind of completed recently, and maybe like what you found out from those projects. Yeah,
so there's a lot, actually, and a lot of our research actually stemmed from the Striped Bass Association, a group of anglers coming together and saying, hey, we love fishing this fish. We need to know more about it. What questions can we answer? And so that's kind of how Striped Bass Research Team started. And so it sort of started with the tagging program. That started, I think, in 2013. We started tagging our own bass. And so we use tagging programs for a lot of different information. We can get growth rates from that, from how much it's grown since when we tagged it, since an angler recaptured it, time at large, how old they are, where they're moving. But we've even stemmed that into even deeper things like fish that we've tagged together, do they stay together when they're moving in their migrations? Are they staying together in different schools? Are they being recaptured within the same week of each other? Things like that, in just the tagging perspective alone. And part of that is, the whole tagging idea came from trying to understand the population dynamics of striped bass. Bay of Fundy is very dynamic. There's a lot of different influences. There's other spawning rivers involved where other populations within Canada have, just one spawning river. Bay of Fundy has, at least used to have 3. Now that's in question. And then there's also the U.S. bass that may or may not come into the Bay of Fundy. So there's a lot of different dynamics. So we're working on that piece. We've also looked into striped bass moving into Labrador. 2017 was the first year that striped bass has ever been recorded in Labrador. It's a expand of their range. So we've looked into that. We've looked at diet studies, aging using otoliths. We've looked at gonads to see what time of year they start developing their eggs and their milt. That's some. We've got a whole lot, yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
A lot of everything that we do is all citizen science, and we try to get people involved with our research because there's no sense collecting this information if we can't share and get people involved and passionate about it. We had a new thing that we just started, which we can get into later if you guys like, the Atlantic Angler Challenge as well, where we've gotten, since COVID has started and a lot of fishing tournaments have kind of been canceled, we sort of started an app that allows anglers to have sort of virtual fishing tournaments, and then all their information gets to help researchers like ourselves answer questions as well. And there's prizes, of course, and all sorts of fun stuff and credit. And yeah.
Yeah, we had Ben Wu on the show last week, and we were talking about that. And I think that's really great because it's not only just like fishing and a tournament and prizes, but all that information on all the species that are included in the challenge is going to be collected. And it's great to have that information. Just for many different reasons.
Yeah.
And Owen, I know that you're doing a lot of tagging this year. You tagged a couple fish this year. You want to kind of tell me about like that, is maybe just if you can talk about like maybe how many fish you tagged and like how you got into it and maybe why or anything you noticed.
Well, like I said, it came from the Striped Bass Association. It used to be called the Striped Bass Anglers Association of Nova Scotia, but it was we changed the name to Striped Bass Association to incorporate more of fishermen, net, inshore, and so forth. And like I said, I was talking to you there the other day. Basically the new group that's coming in as far as anglers is the fly fishermen. It's grown, and basically what we did was we talked amongst ourselves and association, and we were saying, well, we need more knowledge. At the time, Dr. Trevor Avery came in, and he was part of the Acadia team, leading team, and Lita's predecessors, Daniel Quinn and Julia Whidden, started a program called the Ambassadors. Basically, what we did, we took our knowledge that we were recording on the river, so we would go out and we would basically measure the first 10 fish we catch. Some days we'd catch 30 fish each, and there'd be 6 of us. So I mean that's a great morning, great day. And some days you would turn around, well, you might catch 2 or 3. And that led into their tagging program that they started. Basically, and then like Lita said, expanded to citizen science. We end up doing, myself and a couple others end up doing 6 programs within the Mi'kmaq Conservation Group to start tagging fish. We, again, along with other anglers outside of Conservation Group, also took part, and we just basically learned how to tag them. And we record the date, location, length, scale samples, and then we record the number. And if we can, depends on time of the year, the sex. Like you said, sometimes when they're ready to spawn, a male from a female. and I was very fortunate there a couple of weeks ago to tag. I think I tagged 17 in that one evening, of the 25 that I did in one evening, and then 6 days later, one was caught, which was really great because I never heard, like, I knew we can catch. That's one of the questions we asked ourselves: how many times are we catching the same fish? And the tagging program gives us the opportunity to look at that. So, are we catching the same fish? You hear in the river, you're catching the same fish. Well, now we know, right? So it's a good program.
Yeah, but, and with this tagging, like generally, like how long does it take from like what you guys have kind of gathered? Like, how long does it take before you catch that same fish again on average? Because I got a tag fish this year. Couldn't really see the numbers. I figured it was probably tagged a long time ago because, like I told you, Owen and Lita earlier, the tag was only showing a little bit. I could only see the last 4 digits. So I'm thinking it was tagged a while ago. But I don't know, like, are you guys catching them yearly, or does it kind of seem like it's like every couple of years? And can you kind of speak to that? Maybe, Lita, if you have you seen like a correlation to that?
Yeah, so that's something that we look at quite frequently. You know, how many times, or the time at large is the term that we, you know, from when we tag the fish to when it gets recaptured again. That time of large period is usually around 1 to 2 years. That's the most common that we've been getting. And then what you look at is, okay, well, how many times has that fish been recaptured? Has it been recaptured once, twice, 3 times, 4 times? So the most that we've had was a bass caught, I think, 5 times. So we tagged it once, and then it was recaptured 4 times after that. But typically, we get the returns, like that recapture, after we tag it within 1 to 2 years. Sometimes they're at large for 5 years or more before we even get that first recapture. So it varies, which is usually a good indicator of a higher size population, right? Like if you know, we've tagged a few thousand bass over the years. We've done quite a number, and there's still many out there that we've tagged and never had any reports come back. So, you know, that's usually an indication that there's quite a few bass. But, you know, that changes every year. Spawning happens every year. There's mortalities every year. So it's a changing system, but usually 1 to 2 years for average for when we get a recapture first.
What have you noticed kind of similar, Owen? Like,
well, we never really start catching striped bass with tags in them, I think, from the striped bass research team, but we have caught them from DFO, Rob Bradford, and we actually caught one with a North Carolina tag. We questioned at the time how did it come up. We thought it might have been an American fish, but what it was a scientist came up and actually tagged some fish up here with his tags, and we were able to find some information. The older tags, they're really hard to find the information because the documentation is not there. The record keeping is not as good as it is now with laptops and all that. But yeah, it's been a few years. I think when we were working on Jeremy's program, we caught one, and it was a 40-inch fish. It was a big fish, and one of the rules is if it has a tag, we just measure it, right? And my friend's son caught it, and we ended up asking. I shouted out to him, "Does it have a tag? Look for tags." Okay, because that's what we're doing. Because that night we tagged probably close to 60 bass that night, and we were implanting, right? And the student at the time didn't see it. And the closer inspection, he seen the tag. It was a St. John tag, and the tag, it's been, I think it was 10 years, 10, 12 years that it hasn't been caught. So they're out there. It's just a matter of when they're going to get caught. And it's one of those weird stories that, hey, it's the first time you ever seen the tag that old. Like, first time I ever seen one.
Yeah. So go ahead, Lita.
I was going to say that's one thing that we notice as well. So the majority of the bass that we've tagged was at a commercial herring weir. It's a perfect place for tagging because, you know, there isn't any hook damage to the bass. You literally just dip them out of the water, tag them, and then put them in a recovery pond. But the DFO tags that Owen had mentioned, similar perfect tagging situation, they use trap nets, and they do that in Enfield. So it's, not uncommon because they're tagging them right in the same system. Whereas for us, we're getting them about a year later because we're waiting for them to go back out into the bay, into the basin. So that's one thing we'll notice. We'll recapture them in the same areas, but we can touch more on that on the movement patterns if you want.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring that up because I've heard St. John mentioned, I've heard down the States mentioned North Carolina. And I was always kind of under the impression that there was kind of like two populations, really. One from Shubenacadie, Grand Lake, and then another that kind of comes up the eastern seaboard. That was always the impression I had. But I'm wondering now, because are they coming up the eastern seaboard, or are they kind of like permanently in the Bay of Fundy in like deeper water hanging out, or is that a different population? Is there three populations? So from like you guys' research, or can you confirm any of that?
So it's a big question. Yeah. So did you want to go ahead?
Well, one of the things, like you said, there is a very unique population in Shubenacadie, Grand Lake. And something that we've always stated, that we never had the science background, that we knew that there was a Bay of Fundy population, and we thought there might have been an American content, very light, which I would say less than 5%. That's what I'm saying. But most of it's two populations, you were right. And then we also talked about the St. John population as well, that we knew that they were being mixed in. So they were going back and forth. And the one that Steve Delaney talked about, that was Lita actually just reported the other day, was a 48-inch bass that was tagged in New Brunswick that came up to spawn in the Stewiacke, which is wonderful. Because I've had reports of 4-foot bass, even close bigger than that in the past, but it's a rarity. You see it on the Stewiacke now. You see a 40-inch fish, it's a monster fish, world class, right? But you don't hear the 4-footers that often. To hear that, that was like, wow, it's something that. But yeah, we have a very unique population here that even my American counterpart friends down in the States, they're very interested in our fisheries because of that very reason. Because we can go from April to June, mid-June, whereas they only have runs that come in for a few weeks and on. And then we're fortunate enough to have a fall run that goes back up for another month. So it's very unique, world class. Yeah.
So I've got a whole spiel on this because this is a big part of my personal research, based on angler questions and our own questions as well. So Bay of Fundy is one population in Canada, actually. There also is the Southern Gulf of St. Lawrence population, which is where you're seeing the Miramichi bass. And then there's also the St. Lawrence population, which was considered extirpated, mostly due to dredging and commercial fishing, but has been restocked, and there's some natural spawning occurring there now. So there's 3 different populations in Canada. And that's how Canada differentiates populations, is based off geographic location or genetic distinction, or both. So that's kind of why Bay of Fundy is its own population. But within Bay of Fundy, there were 3 spawning rivers. So the Shubenacadie Stewiacke system was one. The Annapolis River was another, but that became extirpated once the causeway was put in. And then the other one was the St. John River, which again, because a dam was put in Mactaquac, that reduced the population it was considered extirpated at one point as well. And now that's in question. Striped bass eggs require flow and tidal cycle to stay afloat. They actually float. And if they sink, then they get covered in sediment and they don't make it. So that's why the other 2 populations in the Bay of Fundy haven't made it. And yeah, exactly as you're saying, population estimates in Bay of Fundy weren't done for quite a while because of that exact question about U.S. bass, right? They're saying, we could do a population estimate, and we can guess how many, bass are in the system, but we don't know if they're Canadian bass. We don't know if they're U.S. bass. So that was sort of something that I tried to answer with my research. which was really quite interesting. So Owen mentioned scale samples. For every striped bass that we've ever encountered, we've always tried to collect scale samples, and we can get sort of mucus and skin tissues off of those scales and use that for DNA to try and estimate what river it originated from. So we know we can make the assumption that, if a bass is in the Shubenacadie River, it's probably a Shubenacadie River origin bass. But as Owen mentioned, we got a tag recapture of a bass that was tagged in the St. John River and recaptured in Shubenacadie. And we also have been working with Sam Andrews. He did some acoustic tagging, it's a different type of internal tag, and actually tracks them going to the Shubenacadie system every year to spawn, and then immediately going back to the St. John system to spend the rest of its year, and then repeating that cycle on an annual cycle. So historically that didn't happen, or at least not to our knowledge, but more recently we're finding that's more evident. So there's being mixture between the two populations, and that's hard to spread out genetically. But what I found, so a lot of my samples came from the Minas Basin rather than within rivers. And so what I looked at is looking at all the larger bass, because based off angler reports, the larger ones were the US bass. So I took about 300 bass, different times of year, mostly towards the fall, because that's what anglers were saying. That's when the US bass were up, and did genetic analysis on all of those to find out, where are they coming from. And from those 300, and this ranged from, I think, 2012 to 2018, only one US bass out of those 300 were from the US. The rest were all Shubenacadie. And so somebody else, so Jeremy Broom, Owen's mentioned a couple times, he did a similar work. He did about the same amount, but all out of Grand Prairie, Nova Scotia. Same thing, about 250. And then I think there's only one or two US bass. So I dug even deeper. That's not enough for me. You got to get right at it. And so I started looking at all historic tag returns that have ever existed back to the 1900s. And looking at, because the US has a much larger tagging program. They actually manage their bass across multiple states as one management unit. And so I've looked at a couple million tags that they've done in the US and looked at all the tagging that's ever occurred in Canada, and looked at how many times has a Canadian bass gone to the US and how many times has a US tagged bass come to Canada. And I could tell you there isn't even 100 records since the 1900s to now. So they do come up here, absolutely. But at the extent that we maybe thought is, we might have exaggerated that a little bit. So, we got to take that exact number, or as close as we can, and then plug that into our population estimates to say, okay, our population, we think the population is this number. And based off these tag reports and this genetic analysis, this proportion of that number is likely US bass, and this proportion is likely Shuby, and this proportion is likely St. John. So yeah, it's some interesting stuff. There's a lot going on.
Wow. Well, I was giving incorrect information all this time, because I thought like those fish, basically there was Grand Lake and then the Eastern Seaboard. So if it's such a small amount coming up, do we have any idea? Are those fish spawning in the Stewiacke, or are they coming up later in the fall just with following warm waters and feed? Do we have any idea?
That one we haven't quite teased out yet. Likely a bit of both, and we don't know if that's because, maybe US bass came up in the fall and then, the water levels, the temperature dropped, and then said, oh shoot, well, I'm going to go join these guys in Grand Lake, and then spawning on the way back, or if they purposely came up in the spring to spawn there, trying to tease out those extra little bits of information to try to figure it out. It definitely wouldn't be uncommon for them to come up here and feed in the fall. So they're more likely to go up towards Annapolis and St. John River to feed, rather than coming all the way up to the Minas Basin. We're finding that a lot of those, the historic tag reports that I mentioned, a lot of the ones that were recaptured in Canada were kind of the outer Bay of Fundy rather than the inner Bay of Fundy. But, definitely the water temperatures get warmer in the fall in the U.S. eastern seaboard. So for them to come up to feed closer to Canada where the temperature is a little bit more reasonable, then, that's definitely something that happens. But just trying to quantify that is just the interesting piece that everybody had always just assumed that if you caught a large bass, that it must be a U.S. bass, but that's not always the case.
Oh, so then these fish must be wintering in the Bay of Fundy somewhere. They're not leaving. They're kind of in the.
So that's the part too, yeah. So I'll let you jump in there, Owen, but I've got a bit about that as well.
Yeah, that's something that I've been saying for years, and we've been saying that there has to be a population that's in the Minas Basin. Like I said, we never actually had proof of it, or we didn't know how to do it. And that's the thing about First Nations, that we always rely on basically our history. And like I said, I heard a story one time that my father caught a bass that was as big as a bathtub. They had pictures of it and everything. That was like probably early 70s, like when they were massive. And we had stories of 4-footers caught on a regular basis. But like I said, we don't know whatever happened to those pictures, stories, but to us, there were stories that piqued our interest in the species. Because when you catch 26, 27, 28 incher, to us, that was a big fish. And then all of a sudden, we had that explosion of bass. I can't remember what year it was. I think it was 2002, 2003, I think, that you could catch an easy triple digits. And they were schoolie fish. And those are the fish that you're seeing now that are exploding out. So they're there. It's just a matter of how they got there. Did they come from different populations? To me, they're there. That's what I like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
That's another thing too. So I'd mentioned that Canada has 3 different population, which is how they're sort of managed as well. The U.S., there's multiple spawning populations or spawning rivers in the U.S. as well. But in the U.S., striped bass overwinter in coastal waters. And in Canada, for the most part, it was our understanding that they overwintered in freshwater lakes. But there was a study done by an Acadia student who actually did some acoustic tagging, and usually you'd put out a receiver and that would listen for an acoustic sound coming from the tag inside the fish. And usually with the tides and the ice, you wouldn't leave a receiver out over winter because you'd lose your gear. But their equipment was actually left out kind of by accident, and actually found some of the larger bass were overwintering in the Minas Passage. So that's another new piece of, well, relatively new. I think that came out in 2016 maybe. But so we are finding that a proportion of the bass are overwintering in the Minas Passage. But again, we don't know how many are doing that. We don't know why. We don't know, we definitely hear from anglers in the Shubenacadie in the spring saying, we're noticing some of these bass have, black backs versus some have sort of green backs. Are the black ones coming from the rivers and the green ones coming from the sea? Well, yeah, there's some merit to that, but we just need to get the scientific evidence to prove it. But there's definitely things like that. Yes, that makes sense. But getting the numbers and putting it down on paper is usually what government wants to see, right? To sort of prove these sort of things.
Yeah, I've noticed that the like some are very dark and some are pale. And I've heard that it's assumed that the darker ones are from Grand Lake, and the more bright fish are kind of the ones that reside in the bay. And it's funny because this year I was actually telling Owen this, on what was that, Friday, Saturday this past week, there was a good spawn happening. We got into some fish and they were all very bright, almost green. And the ones prior to that had been a little bit darker. And I noticed it right away. I was like, wow, that fish is so pale. It's almost got a green hue to it. So you said that's something you guys are still working on proving. Are you kind of leaning towards that idea? I think Owen, you kind of talked about with that as well. What do you think, Owen? Because I mean, you've seen them for years and years and years. Do you have like an opinion on that?
Well, I'm going to agree with you, and I'm going to use this analogy. We've all trout fished, and we've all seen in the springtime. Talk about the colors of the fish, the trout. The resident trout are smaller, and they have these dark patches on them. If you ever notice, them look like bruises because they buried themselves and all that. And then you have the sea run trout, which are normally bigger and have that silvery fleck on them, and it starts to fade. And I think the same thing happens as they salinize and desalinize within the systems that they have to have that coating on. So it's there. And I think that, like salmon, bass may change a bit colors as they get ready to spawn. So, but yeah, you do normally see the darker ones coming from Grand Lake. You rarely see them in the springtime in the Enfield run being green. You might see the odd one, but for the most part, they're all dark and black stripes. And then you'll start seeing what we call the greenbacks. We call them bay bass, right?
Oh yeah, okay.
And I find that tendency that the bay bass will come in that first week in June on that flood tide to spawn, and they're big ones, always big ones. That first week in June, I find anyway.
Okay. Lita, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, so it's not something that we've directed a lot of research towards. There was a researcher by the name of Roger Rolfson. He's from the University of North Carolina, who's come up into the Bay of Fundy to do research in the 80s. And so he looked at some of that, and I don't think it was either processed, or perhaps I just don't remember if there was any finite conclusions about that. But it makes sense, you got to adapt to your environment a little bit. And so having the darker back, if you're a predator looking down in freshwater, it's going to be harder to see them if you've got a darker back. But whereas in the ocean, you're usually a predator looking up, and so you're looking towards the light, or and so it's more beneficial in your favor to have a lighter color. And I find when you're changing into different environments, a lot of fish, not just striped bass or trout, there's a lot of fish that will change their appearance or their coloration slightly to adjust to the environment and to adjust to things like that. So whenever people say to me, "Hey, what's this white fish?" I'm like, "No, you got to give me more than that. I don't trust color."
Yeah, good point. Good point. So we've talked a little bit about, do we have any, if you were to throw a number out on population in the Bay of Fundy, or just what comes into the Stewiacke, could you kind of give like I know it's probably like it's hard to figure out an actual number, but would you give like an estimate in your opinion? Maybe I'll go with Owen first and then Lita. It just kind of like if you had to estimate like from what you've seen or research you've heard or read about, like what would you say, Owen, if you had to throw a number out there of how many fish come into the Stewiacke River to spawn, what would you say?
I would sell at least 250,000, 250,000. Okay. And it's weird because it's one of the things that Jim Dustin was doing a few years ago when we actually had this presented at a meeting from DFO that presented, and Dr. Trevor Avery actually background is mathematics as well, and we had a good chuckle about this. Jim Dustin gave us a cross section of the eggs collected, and he said that they came from X amount of females. And then he also they stated in there that the pods that you see, and you've seen them online, I don't know if anybody has, but they're big pods, and they're normally one female getting pushed by several 10 to 15 males. And using that ratio, I came up with a number that was very big, and DFO said, "How did you do that?" I said, "I'm just using numbers that you gave me," and it wasn't an inflated number. But they were just amazed, and they said, "We didn't think it was that big," right? And it was actually over the 250K that I said, well over it. So,
so what was the number that they gave you based off the eggs?
I can't remember, but they said it came from 120,000 females, and being at a ratio of 7 7 to 1 females in a pod, maybe even 10 to 1. That's almost 1 million fish.
Yeah.
And there have been times.
What, 2010?
No, I can't remember. I don't know if you were there at that day or not. But that was they had that meeting in Stewiacke, and it was like but we had an explosion one year. It was crazy. I mean, the spawn would go on for 12 hours straight until the next tide in Stewiacke. I mean, I don't know if some people that know our tides are very dynamic, very high, and they come in and spawn on fallen tide. But basically, it would only be a couple hours of spawn, and it would go by you. But when you get in the front of it, and they can spawn in front of you for 12 hours straight, and then do it all over again, that to me is a big spawn. And I think that's what our explosion of population we had at the time. And the numbers they had to be, I would say it was close to what I was saying at the time. And I estimated well over at the time. I told them 250,000. In my opinion, coming out of Grand Lake, but that's only Grand Lake.
Right.
But I don't know what the Minas Basin has, because the fact that the Minas Basin is so, when tide comes in, you can't see anything, right? Grand Lake, when they come out, it's nice and clear. You can see them. You can watch them go by. I've taken pictures of them and blocked them out, basically marked them out and edited them out, and hit 400 or 500 fish in one school. And that's only one part of the school, right? But yeah, the numbers are, and that's what the striped bass research team is trying to do through capture, recapture, to see how many tagged fish there are. And like I said, I'll let Lita go into that aspect of the mathematics.
Yeah, I definitely, in my opinion, I would have thought it was higher than 250,000, but you're right. So for anyone who doesn't know out there, when striped bass spawn, basically, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but from my observations, a female comes to the top, will kind of lay the eggs, and then like Owen said, a pod. So it's usually there's quite a few males to one female just kind of rolling around, laying eggs, milting. So I think what you're saying is correct. If they're saying there's 120,000 females, like if you're even lowballing it and saying there's 4 males per female, then that's right there is almost 500,000 fish. And I mean, from what I've seen in the river, where there's like a whole kilometer stretch bank to bank, like almost top to bottom filled with fish, if you think like how many fish you can actually fit in there, I would have guessed 250,000 as like a lower number, but I mean, if you've been on the Stewiacke, like you said, I mean, you can't see 6 inches under the surface. So maybe I am overestimating, but I think that's a good point that you made about, the male to female ratio for sure. Lita, what do you think is an estimate?
I don't think as like a scientist I could throw a number out there.
Oh, just for fun then. Stop being a scientist for a minute.
Well, and you probably knew I was going to say that, didn't you? And the other thing is to consider as well as, it's one thing to consider all the bass spawning in the Shubenacadie-Stewiacke system, but there's other river systems in the Bay of Fundy that are contributing to the catch in the area as well. So when government's making regulations on retention, so how many fish you can keep in the summertime, you don't really know if you're catching shoot-beat bass. I mean, that kind of leads back to that genetic and mixing question that we kind of talked about before. But, in the past, they've only based retention off population in the Stewiacke only. But really, if the St. John River is spawning in St. John River, then that's something to be considered as well. And our St. John River bass hanging out in the Minas Basin, So there's lots of different things for population in terms of what that means for how many fish you can keep. But yeah, the population is definitely doing better than it was. I mean, there was at one point when I first started where, you'd speak to an angler and they'd say, you know what, I spent, 8 to 10 hours fishing and caught one bass. Whereas, you speak to an angler now and they'd say, oh yeah, I fished for a couple hours, got 30 fish, no big deal. So, definitely based off that catch per unit effort piece. So usually when we talk to anglers, we have a logbook program too, like Owen was saying, record your first 10 fish. But also when people report tags, we ask, okay, how many bass did you catch during that fishing trip that weren't tagged? And how long were you fishing for? Because that helps us get effort. And so that'll help, so that kind of tells you if you're spending 5 minutes fishing and you catch 30 fish, either you're a really good fisherman or there's lots of fish versus somebody who's spending, 8 hours and they caught 30 fish, it's going to be a smaller size. But, I would say Owen's probably got a better handle on the population just on a daily basis, being out there fishing. But yeah, sorry, I'm going to give you the general. I can't give you a good number for fun, but the population is definitely doing higher, and I think it seems healthy. Like, we're seeing good spawning events, we're seeing good recruitment, just on the ground, seeing that, and that's starting to show up in our data.
Cool. Yeah, I think Owen's the only guy that could catch like 30 fish in 5 minutes anyway that I know of. So it's certainly not me.
I wouldn't say that. But there are spots that you can catch a lot of fish quickly.
Yeah.
But that reminds me of a story that when this is before Lita joined the team. We were trying with Danielle and Julia, and we had to go to all the First Nations in the Confederacy Mainland Micmacs, the conservation groups group, and then we went to Fort Folly, New Brunswick. They were the only First Nations outside of Nova Scotia that we're part of, and they were very interested to talk to us because they knew who we were and they wanted to know, they wanted to hear some of our striped bass stories. But we went there and we heard this one lady's testimony. She said, I had my best year ever. She said, I go out there in the morning right in the tide, and basically I fish my secret spot, and all year I caught 12 fish. My biggest fish I caught in my life was 27 inches. And I'm looking at my friend Derek, and we're looking at each other, and as you can say, okay, 12 fish all summer, and the biggest was 27 inches. And so, okay, you have to come down to Shooby Stew, and you'll be blown away. Right? It's just where they're at. It's like to see them way up in Fort Folly is a great thing, and their program, they're actually getting more bass to come up along with other fish. That it's the progress that they're doing in the last, I would say, 10 years. To just see count one bass in their fence, and then count probably 10 years later counting well over 200. It's like from 1 to 200, it's a big jump, right? So they're spreading.
Yeah. Right? It's something I was curious about. How fast do they grow? Because I was looking at one of I think it was on Facebook, one of the tagged fish, and it was caught like 5 years later, and it didn't really grow very much. So I'm wondering, is that common? Are they pretty slow growing fish?
Yeah. So in the Bay of Fundy compared to the U.S., they're going to have a longer growing season because the water's warmer earlier. But in the Bay of Fundy, I find, or at least what we've been able to find so far, is that once they get to a certain age or a certain size, usually just past keeper size, their growth slows right down. Once they've gotten like 2 or 3 years old, the growth is pretty steady. It increases quite a bit, but once they get closer to that keeper size, which keeper size is ideally a female at 6 years old, which is the first year of spawning, which is why the regulations are set at that. But usually past that, the growth slows significantly. I find sometimes that the growth more goes towards weight versus length. I mean, that's more of an observation than a data point, but usually towards like 6, 7, 8 years old, their growth starts slowing down quite a bit.
So one of those big fish that's like 40 inches, because I mean, I don't know, 40 inches is pretty big. Like I think I may have caught one 40-incher in my life. How old would that fish be? An estimate of how old that fish would be?
This one I could put a fun guess towards, but I would put that probably like around 20, 25 years.
Wow, that long. Jeez.
Yeah. There is a really good resource to striped bass. I think it's on Striped Bass 24/7 or one of the sites. It has a length to weight chart, and basically that chart has, if the fish is 40 inches, it's this old. The minimum, on average, they got a minimum weight, an average weight, and a maximum weight.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that to be within a range. Like one year I caught a 42-inch bass, and it should have been around 33 pounds. Believe it or not, that's what it was, 33 pounds. So I find that the weight is that chart is very good. Again, it may be off by a few pounds and it may be off by a year or two, but it's a very good guide to go by. And basically, it's a resource that people don't fully understand. Like Lita said, a female has to get a certain age before it spawns. So it's really good to gauge, say, okay, this fish is this big. It's this year, this old. It's not a male, right? Because the males milk at a younger age. It hasn't reached spawn yet, so we can put it back, like she said, and that's how the regulations are brought up in Nova Scotia. So it's a really good resource to look at. And I actually had laminated a bunch of those cards, and I shrunk them down. I must have had about 50 cards, and I gave them all out that first week, I think, and it was like, wow, everybody wanted one.
Yeah, so. Yeah, I've seen similar charts online. So speaking about like the regulations, I want to know, like, how do you guys feel about the regulation? Because some people are under the impression, like, 27 and up, it should be a slot size because, you're big 40 inchers, like, lay a lot more eggs and stuff. It seems like the regulations are working, though, if our populations are growing, so that's good. But how do you guys feel about how they are currently? Is there anything, like, you think you would change? Would you go to a slot size? Is there something else? I've heard people talk about, like, maybe have tags like they used to do for salmon, like maybe certain amount of tags a year, or, you got to buy the tags. Because I know I was talking to a friend out in Alberta, and when they go to keep walleye there, you have to buy tags. I think it's like $20 for 5 tags. Is that like an option here, or do you think like everything's good, it's working? What do you think? What do you think, Owen?
Well, that's something that the association is looking at. Looking at regulation changes, seeing what works and what doesn't work. Nova Scotia happens to have border 2 different regions, the Bay of Fundy region and the Gulf region, and both have regulation changes within each. Technically in Nova Scotia, you can have 4 bass in your possession and not be over. You can have 1 from the Bay of Fundy, right, and then you can have 3 from the Gulf. So you can have 4, but they're going to be different sizes. So, and Miramichi is having really good success with their slot size and their regulations. So we want to be able to look at that and say, can we apply that to us and basically move forward? Because Miramichi is doing excellent as far as their numbers wise. Seeing the spawn this year, and it was amazing, right? And I just happen to note that and something that first time I noticed this in a while, that the Miramichi spawn and the Stewiacke spawn happened on the same day twice. Normally we're a week ahead of them.
Yeah,
it was cool because as soon as they put the video footage up, they're sending me the video footage. It's like, wow, we just shot this today, and wow, we just had a big spawn there last Friday, and they were spawning the game there, right in Miramichi. It's cool, but we're looking at the entertaining regulation changes, right? We're always open for that, and the association is not there to please the angler. We're there to basically speak for fish, the resource, because without the resource, you can't have a fishery. So we have to protect that resource as best we can. Some changes aren't popular. Like last year, we had to extend the closure, the bait retention and closure. Yeah. Due to the fact that it was cold, wet, and rainy, and it basically delayed the spawn because they spawn according to temperature. It was we basically had a meeting and said, yeah, let's do it. And basically, some people were kind of upset about it. Some people weren't. and people are on the fence either way. But it was the best decision we had to make for the species, and that's what we got to do. So, but slot size is definitely on the table.
Cool. What do you think, Lita? What are your feelings about it?
Well, yeah, it's a hot topic for sure. I mean, and a big part of why we're doing this research, because so Miramichi is a great example. A lot of people over the more recent years had assumed that striped bass in the Miramichi system were invasive because people forgot that they were there. Their population has always been there. It's been there for thousands of years. There used to be commercial fisheries for striped bass in the Miramichi system decades ago, but the population got so low that they put a memorandum on them so nobody could fish them for over 5 years, and people kind of forgot that they existed. But DFO did a great job, I think, in that region, putting in benchmarks. So saying, once the population hits this level for 3 out of 5 years, then we're going to open up recreational angling. Once they reach this population for this many years, then we'll open up increase how many you're allowed to keep. Once it reaches that, then you can open up a commercial fishery. So they've got great understanding of how many fish there are and what that means for the population. And I find in the Bay of Fundy, we don't know that. We don't know how many fish there are in the system. And so I find it's hard to make decisions on changing regulations without knowing how it's going to affect the system. I think, based off what you observe this time of year, it looks like the population is doing really well. But if something happens to the Shuby system, that population is gone, right? Like that's the main spawning system. So if a dam got put in, or if some toxic substance went in, or something, happened to the Shuby system, it would be in trouble. I think, so in the slot system versus the keeper system, which we currently have, it depends on kind of what you want to target, right? So, so the keeper size is, I think I said it before, is the minimum age at which a female can spawn in that system. And so it's giving the chance to replace itself at least once or twice over. And then the larger the female gets, the more eggs she produces. And so basically what we're doing is just replacing that bass and then taking out the larger ones, which might produce more. When you give a slot size, you get the larger bass to stay and produce more, then you get to keep smaller ones, which may, depending on how the population is doing, be more beneficial, because then you get more fish. And for a lot of people and a lot of families, it's a food source, and it's, a great way to take advantage of the system and things like that. But, I always try to err on the side of caution about making regulation changes without knowing the big picture, without knowing the basics. And I feel like we're not there. The last time DFO has done a population estimate was, I think, 2005. So, that needs an update. Before you make any regulation change, you got to know, how is that going to affect the population? For sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I got my own opinions on it, but I mean, coming from, a sport fisherman that I really don't target them outside of, this month when they're in the Stewiacke. I kind of gave up fishing them in the bay. Just, I don't know, not really my style anymore to kind of sit there and bait fish. I'd rather go and target other species and whatnot. Nothing against people who do. That's great. I love that people are getting out there fishing. And like Owen said, like striped bass fisheries has exploded in the last few years. I mean, the amount of people that are striped bass fishing now is crazy. I mean, when I first started fishing the river, and that wasn't that long ago, I see way more people on the river now, and a lot more fly fishermen, which is awesome, because I mean, there's definitely the opportunity for fly fishermen to catch big fish. I mean, really, like, your big game fish for fly fishermen is salmon, and I mean, you can go seasons without hooking one. And I've had some people out this year that fly fish, and they're blown away. They're like, oh, there's no other fishery here where you can hook this many big fish in one day. So from that aspect, I would like to see regulation changes, just because I think we have something world class. And what I'm scared of is, like, yeah, it's great now, population like numbers are good, but like you kind of want to keep it that way. Like, why? Like, that's kind of coming from my perspective. And like you said, like anything could happen. And, you know, when I heard about Alton Gas and Shiobi, that's the first thing I thought of. I was like, oh my God, like that's, if something, because I think, Owen, I think you told me that the eggs have to have a certain salinity in the water, right? To hatch,
Well,
is that correct?
It's the flow. It's the flow that's crucial.
The flow,
and,
okay.
Yeah, and the ability to float. And basically they hatch so quick, which is a good thing. But if something changed, like Lita said, something could change, could basically wipe out the population. There was Lita can give me might remember the year. There was basically a year that we had zero spawn, and that was because of environmental factors. Basically, there was either lots of rain to increase the flow of water, it just washed them away, or basically it was just got really hot and they just couldn't. We basically had zero spawn that year, and we were worried about a crash. But like you said, the big fish that can replenish, like you have a female at 42 inches or that 48 fish that was caught there last week, as opposed to a 26-inch female who's going to have more eggs, right? You know, the big female is going to, and that's what DFO attributed, along with the changes like the moratorium that happened, that brought the species back. And 10 years ago, we introduced the bait ban. I actually had to come up with an idea, was make a catch and release until such a time, because at the meeting they were saying we don't want to keep the fish, we just want to catch them. But they didn't want to stop using bait at the time. Bait fishermen at the meeting was really, there were a lot of them, so they basically had the say of the meeting. But my thing is, you guys don't want to keep them, you just want to catch them. Well, let's make it catch and release until, and I said after the spawn, right? They said, no, we can't do that. We have to have, right? So they kind of told me they want to keep them. And at the time, Greg Stevens from DFO said that, well, we'll make it to this point, confluence, then you can keep them. And I told Greg at the time that, well, you just create a loophole. What they're going to do is they're going to go where they can bait fish and catch and keep them. So when that closure date happened, sure, there were a few fishermen still bait fishing, but basically the river got scarce. And they all went down to below the Stewiacke to where they can bait fish and catch and keep them. And what they did was DFO did a really good job of protecting spawning ground, but not the spawners, because as the tide falls out or if the water gets warmer or cooler, they'll move. And what they were doing is they were holding down further in the river system, in the Shiobi. And it just happened to be where you had 100 fishermen bait fishing. Yeah. So that year, and we went down there and we looked at it. The place was crawling with people, and a friend of mine who now is a commercial fisherman wanted to know what's going on. And said, why are all these people that before never fished here? Now there's like 100 fishermen. And then you go down there and you see these big 40-inch fish being taken out on a daily basis. So they protect the spawning ground, but not the spawners. And what I said, that's what's going to happen, and what we're seeing now is the fact that instead of seeing that spawn all day long, this is the first time we actually seen it in years, and instead of basically standing in front of you and spawn for 12 hours straight, which, like I said, first time we had in years, we had to chase them. Basically, you find them, they go by you for 2 hours, then you had to fall down again with them, chase them for 2 more hours, and so forth. So we kept on leapfrogging. This was the first year we didn't have to do that, which means they're starting an upsized trend. But in the past, and we had actually had a meeting in the association, and science actually backed us up on that, because he said there are the numbers, and they were looking at it, and they could tell that, yeah, there was a downswing, but I think it might be just a natural progression of the species. You go up and down, like anything else, like rabbits. So yeah. It's something to keep an eye on, because any one factor could affect the spawn for that given year. Yeah, so. And that's what I think for me the big worry with Alton Gas was, is like, man, if all you got to do is kill off like that spawn, and then that's it. Like this is the main place where all those fish spawn. Like you can devastate a whole population. So, but so yeah, I mean. Rule changes, yeah. I mean, everyone's got their own opinion.
But I mean, right now it seems like things are going well. Population's still increasing. So I mean, I don't know if there will be a change. I think, maybe like something around like the Stewie Act, but I think, maybe for the time being with what I just learned today, okay, maybe we can keep the regs the same for now and kind of monitor things. But I definitely think the spawning time around the Stewie Act could be there could be a few changes. Maybe just push it back a little bit later. Like you said, last year was really cold. They had to do the variance order June 11th, so tomorrow is when you can actually start to keep them again and fish bait. And last year on June 11th, there was a huge spawn. It was like one of the first spawns that they did because it was so cold.
Yeah.
So I think, maybe pushing it back is maybe not such a bad idea.
And if I could just jump in and add one extra thought in terms of regulations too is, the Striped Bass Association is a great resource for any anglers or anybody interested in striped bass and fisheries. It gives them a voice, right? There's a lot of opposition to striped bass sometimes. They are predators, and so there's concerns about competition with other fish species. And I find, joining the Striped Bass Association, there's more leverage to protecting the species and getting more regulations towards what sizes that you do want to keep because, and you're all separated and, maybe the odd person reaches out to DFO, but when you're all together in a group and you're voicing your concerns, it's more powerful. So, I'd recommend anybody to check out the Striped Bass Association and go to the meetings that Owen's mentioned because we do bring a lot of science to it. We do bring up people's concerns and DFO sits in on those meetings, actually. They attend the meetings themselves. They provide their information and they write down everybody's concerns. So I highly recommend that for anybody interested in having any concerns or questions about the regulations.
Yeah, and I guess while we're on the topic, Owen, how can you join, or if you're if you love striped bass and you want to go in and talk striped bass or be a part of any of these talks about regulations or changes, how can someone join the group? Where can we find you?
Well, you can look us up on Facebook, Striped Bass Association or Striped Bass Research Team. I think there's a link on there as well to our website, stripedbassassociation.ca, and there is a join button there, and they will take your information. Right now, it is currently free to join. We have had fees in the past to help create a fund so that we can take out advertisements and so forth. Like I said, it's a great voice, and like I said, this year, in the past couple of years, I've seen an increase in fly fishermen, and to me, the fly fishermen have a very little voice in our association because we don't have that many members that fly fish, and I'd love to see more of that group join in because we do have, like I said, we have lure fishermen, we have bait fishermen, we have inshore fishermen that are part of it. Basically, the fly fishermen don't have the voice that they should, but by joining us, at least they can bring us into their insight because, like you said, it was salmon at one time, but everybody has fun doing bass. Like in the last couple of years, I've seen bass fishermen outfish lower fishermen. Like I'm a lower fisherman on any given day. We were there one day and they were kept beating us 4-1, which was I was like totally amazed at it. It's like wow. And like I said, you were out on the boat there last week, and another friend of mine, Matt Dort, he was out on the boat. He fly fishes, and their success rate is to me great. And it's like I said, it's a world class fishery that they're taking advantage of. That they need that voice, so it's there.
Yeah. So yeah, fly fishermen. If you're listening out there, look up the Striped Bass Association, get involved. But I stopped really fishing lures. It's mostly fly fishing for me now, and it's just I find it more effective. Now that's maybe speaking to the day. I know I'm sure I've been outfished by you on the river many times using lures, but I kind of think overall for me, and bass are pretty sensitive to kind of cold fronts and rain and stuff. So to me, I find there's a lot more slower days. And we kind of talked, earlier this week about how the hot bite is just before a spawn or correlating to a moon and a tide. So a lot of the times I found the bite was always slow, but when I started kind of slowing it down and fly fishing, I was getting a better like hookup ratio. I was hooking more fish in a day. And I mean, I'm not really sure why. I can kind of guess that maybe it's like, you know, the muddy water and the smaller fly presentation and the way that the fly kind of hangs in their face a little longer, maybe. Because, you know, I kind of apply the same kind of slower presentations to other species when I fish on slower days. Maybe that has something to do with it. I'm not really sure. But I definitely think, you know, as a fly fisherman, that, yeah, I think that we need to have a voice in this too, because, you know, this is going to be one of the next big, you know, fisheries in Nova Scotia for fly fishermen. You know, a lot of guys are kind of getting into it. A lot of guys are hearing about it, and they go and they're like, you know, I've run into people that from out of province, not this year, obviously with COVID and everything, but last year, and guys are actually ran into a guy that fished the Miramichi, and he came down and he was like, this is incredible. Like, your fish are huge compared to the Miramichi, and, you know, we're catching them like basically at our feet here. Like, he was amazed all the fish he hooked were like 3 feet offshore, you know, and he didn't need a boat, and he didn't have to go to the Miramichi. So I think that it's going to become very popular. So I think that fly fishermen definitely, you know, have to have a voice in there too. So you're right. So again, fly fishermen, look up the Striped Bass Association. I think there's one more topic that I kind of want to cover, and I kind of want both of your take on this. But this is, I'm going to start with you, Owen, because you told me a really interesting thing. I think it was last year about June bugs, and it's kind of comes from like Mi'kmaq culture. And you were telling me, like, you know, I think you said something about night peepers too. I think it's like when you hear the frogs at night, like they come into the river. But the one that really stuck with me was the June bugs. When you see June bugs, they're going to spawn. And this year, I kid you not, I was looking. I fished on a Monday. The first big spawn happened on a Wednesday, and I was kind of looking at temperature. I went out on Monday. There was a few fish around. And then I was looking at the weather, and I was looking at the water temperature on Monday, and I thought, Wednesday's going to be the day. And sure enough, Tuesday night was the first time I saw June bugs out on the deck. And I thought, let's see if Owen's right. And the next day was probably the most insane day I've ever seen on the river, just spawn everywhere. So I kind of want you to talk about, like how did that, like, when was the first time you heard that? Like, it was really interesting to me. So I want your take on that, and like what like just speak about that, because it was so interesting to me, and I couldn't believe when I actually showed up Wednesday and I got on the river and I got to the spot and there was just spawn everywhere. I was like, June bugs, man, he was right. Like, this is crazy. So just like talk about that, because I think everyone's going to find that really like interesting.
Well, I've talked about it before, but like I said, being First Nations, our people survived here for 14,000 years. Mm-hmm. By observing what went on around them and basically applied that knowledge, and they gave names to what was happening on around them. Like here's an example. The month of January is January for English. For Mi'kmaq, it's Panamujuguis, which means frost fish, the tomicod. Basically what happens then there is they all come in to spawn. And it's basically they're there. And every month we have something going on, like February is a snow blinding month. And that's when we have most of our blizzards, it's February. And then we have basically time. So May is, we call it the frog croaking month. Happens normally, it goes from new moon to new moon, not the full moon. The full moon's the halfway cycle. So new moon to new moon, and basically we call it the frog croaking month. They enter the system, whether they're coming out of Grand Lake into the Shibby system or out of the bay into the waters. And basically, story I was saying to one person in the Enfield. Not sure if everybody knows the Enfield run. Everybody goes there and they observe it. They just watch all these fish come out of the lake, and they're in the river, and it's only like 4 feet of water. They're everywhere. So a friend of mine says, I come down here every single night looking for these fish, right? And he said, 3 years in a row, you show up one night, and they're here. He said, how do you know? And so I said, this is how I know. And I tell him, right? So we always have a little system that we go on, like when the fish trode and so forth and all that. And it's the frog croaking. We call it the peepers. And every year I'll take Lita and all my research friends that I have every year, and we'll go and say, okay, that's the song that we were waiting for. So we'll start fishing. and you will get them here and there, the odd one. I think the earliest I ever caught up a striped bass was March 21st, right?
Wow.
In the system, because I can fish. Like I wanted to go out because it was one of those days. It was warm when I went out and caught a small schoolie, but for the most part they hit about mid-April, and they come in, and I find that when they come into the system, Grand Lake bass especially, they're not feeding. So this is one of the reasons why they don't bite as much coming out of Grand Lake. And I was talking to Jeremy. I said, "Why is that?" It was one of the questions he asked. How come all the fish that are coming in Grand Lake are empty? Because they were caught. So few were caught. They were taken, right? And we cleaned them. They're empty. There's nothing in them. So they come down, and he explained to me, and Lita can actually, I don't know if she can verify this or not, but he said that the bladder in the fish changes with the salinity level. So what happens, and then feeding is, again, temperature related. So as the year goes on, it gets a little bit warmer, and they hit the salt water, the tidal section, and it just seems like they turn on. So this is why we don't really target them up high. We target them more in the tidal section. And there are days, and I'm not a word of lie, you can catch 20 to 30 big fish, right? And then you go back the next day and not catch any. It's just you have to be there, right time, right place. You have to put your time in. And that's what I did. So over the years, I listened to the stories, like I said, of my elders, and they would always tell me this, and they probably heard it from that. So we just continually kept on doing it. And as I got older, and I watched it and listened a little bit more, I said, hey, yeah, this is right. And then there's a lull between probably in the first week of May to May 17th, you'll have basically, you won't catch any. And you notice that this year there was no fish in that river. What they were doing was they were riding the tide and staying way down. I found that out later. But they would come in, and then they would sit there, and they'd be staying on the bottom. And then they would slowly come up. And then at night, they would just start feeding. It's when that water hit a certain temperature. And then I noticed that, okay, hey, they're feeding before the tide. They're feeding on the tide. And then the falling tide. And then, boom, they would stop. And then what happens? A few days later, they would spawn. Then I would always notice June bugs because everybody doesn't like June bugs in their hairs. Lita probably, Lita's an exception to the rule. She'll bend over backwards for but
I look forward to it.
Yeah, and like I said, I tag you every year in the post, and I try to take a picture every year. And I was talking to Dr. Trevor Avery, and he was very interested in that. And they said I put two and two together. That they come out a certain temperature when the ground hits a certain temperature, they come out. And every time I noticed that these fish are always spawning, because I go to Stewiacke every day, and they're always spawning. So it's like, okay, let's see if it's right. Let's see if it's true. So this had to be about 15, 20 years ago. It's holding up every year. It's holding up. And basically they'll spawn. And they'll spawn every, on that fallen, that I would say new moon or full moon tide around late April and the first week in June. And I always found that the big bay bass come in that first moon tide in June. And they tend to go right back out after they spawn. But you will have some feet that will feed on a regular basis because they're there. They're going to be there now, and there's just not going to be the numbers that you and I seen there a couple of weeks ago. But it's something that I noticed, and they always spawn until the lightning bugs come up. As soon as the lightning bugs come up, the fish are gone. And it's something that I've always went by. And I think an elder told me, he said, now you are learning what it is to live as Mi'kmaq. You're learning what's around you. He said, take that knowledge and teach the next generation. So I teach whoever wants to learn. And I may not have a teaching degree or anything, but at least I would say, a good understanding of what's going on around me. And like I said, I've talked to all the students about this, and they're really intrigued about it. It's why? And they can quantify that. And like I said, it's temperature related. And it's a pretty cool feature, I think.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you taught me because yeah, I saw the June bug in the window, and I just texted my buddy. I was just in a way kind of kidding around, like, June bugs are outside. Be ready for tomorrow. I was like, what? I was like, June bugs. Owen Marr said June bugs, and it's going to be incredible fishing. And I showed up, and I couldn't believe it that they were just spawning everywhere. I was like, man, June bugs, that's crazy. But so, okay, from a science perspective, Lita, and I think kind of Owen touched on temperature. Would you confirm that that's probably what it is? That like kind of different species of whether they're fish or insects or anything, it's all kind of related because of temperature? Is that what you would say from a science perspective?
Yeah, I mean, temperature or some other environmental factor, but it's funny. I've got, even in just old notebooks here, I've got one from 2016, April 2nd. Peepers are out, like that's our notes, and we get them from Owen. So every time, every spring, we look forward to hearing from Owen saying, oh, peepers are out, oh, June bugs are out. And so I look forward to it now. And I think kind of adding the science bit to it is interesting to look into it, but it also kind of ruins it a little bit too, because it's kind of nice just not just knowing, yeah, okay, these bugs are out. Okay, well, that means that the fish are coming. But I would say definitely temperature related. I did hear of another one, Owen, and maybe, I mean, it's not striped bass related, but I've heard someone say to me that once the grass turns green, then the Gasparoa are running. That's another one. So if you want bait.
Well, a lot of people don't realize that, like I said, there's and it all starts early in March. When you start, like, again, our language tells us it's the forerunner to spring. So we start from there, and it's always like a 2-week cycle because you'll always have a trout run around March break, give or take a week. Normally it's a week later. And then you can almost time the smelt run. Once you time the smelt run, you can look at the Gasper run, shad run, bass run, and they're basically they follow a cycle, and that's what we learn from, right? So it's a pretty cool aspect once you put it all, the whole puzzle together, and you just one goes right into the next, right? Mm-hmm. So and then that's why I talked about the flies earlier. Like you learn about, okay, oh, I'm not going out there. The bitemnoseums are out there. No, right? And you can't even go out there and I'm getting bit. You don't realize you're getting bit. Black flies, mosquitoes, horseflies, it's the bitemnoseums that everybody hates because you can't see them, but they all follow a cycle that once you learn, it's cool. It's one of those things that, hey, this is something that I can take and apply to what I'm doing out here.
Yeah, I always found the good trout bite when you start seeing the black flies get real crazy. You're like, oh, I know the trout are out there, but I don't know if I can go out there amongst all those black flies. So
I'll give you a tip. I'll give you a tip when the black flies come out.
Okay.
Okay. In June, the month for June, we call it the leaf budding time. The full leaf. That's what's happening now. The full leaf. So when you see those buds first come out on the trees, black flies will start every single time.
Oh, okay.
When you start seeing that green of the leaves come out, you'll start seeing black flies.
Right. So if I want to catch the trout of a lifetime here, like what am I looking for? What insects or what's nature going to tell me? I need help with that.
Well, it tells you every day. You just got to listen.
Okay.
It's philosophy. It's something that is like, okay, what's happening around me, and what do I do, or what do I see? And you take that knowledge, and that's what traditional knowledge is. We take it, what's happening around, and what's happening here, what's happening there, and then we apply it. And then, hey, this every year, and it's cool. It's one of the few things that it's nature's timetable. If you listen to it, it's there.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow, that's so cool, man. Like my mind is blown with all of that. Like just to kind of see it firsthand was really cool. Yeah. So if you have any more tips of what kind of things I should look out for to be a better fisherman, you let me know anytime. You let me know anytime. So we've covered a lot today. So I'm going to give you guys like kind of one opportunity. If there's anything else you want to talk about or anything else you think is important, you let the viewers know, and you talk about that, and maybe we'll wrap it up. So is there anything else you think we missed that's important, or something that you want people to know? this is your time. So maybe Lita, we can start with you. Is there anything that you want to add or think we missed, or something that's important that you think people should know about?
Sure. I mean, I think the only, takeaway at the end of this that I'd like to leave people with is, we've talked about working with anglers and how that informs our research and how our research informs anglers. So I think I maybe missed on how to tell people to get involved. So we do have our striped bass research team Facebook page, and then we have a website, stripedbass.ca. But the Facebook page, if anglers want to get involved with any sort of research or have any questions, like regularly we'll have people reach out to us and say, hey, can you answer this question? And we'll go through our data and try to answer that, even though it's not published or anything. We'll try and answer questions. So if, anglers want to learn how to tag, if they want to tell us about their catches, if they want to learn how to report a tagged fish, or just want to see other tagged fish that have been recaptured in their records and their really cool stories about how much they've grown and where they've gone. So just follow us on our Facebook page, and we'll get people more involved. And the Atlantic Angler Challenge you mentioned before, that's another way as well.
Awesome. Yeah. So let's say people are out there and they're catching fish. Could they just take a measurement for you and just mention, hey, I got this many fish today. Here's all the measurements. Is that something they could just do? Like just record and just kind of give you that information?
Absolutely. Yep. They can do that. We can send you a logbook to write it down in if you want. That's on waterproof paper. Main things that we look for is date and location and length. But even if you give us, hey, went to Stewiacke on June 10th, fished for 3 hours, got 30 fish, that's all good for us too, right? So every bit of data, is helpful.
Yeah. I think that. Yeah, I think that's good advice. So, if there's anyone out there that does a lot of bass fishing, and I mean, clearly, if you're doing a lot of striper fishing, then, you love the species, you love fishing for them. So do what you can to help, I mean, if you're out there fishing anyway, take a measurement, you get a free logbook apparently. Like, yeah, that's awesome. So I think I encourage everyone to do that. Owen, any final words, anything you want to add?
Yeah, well, like I said, the Striped Bass Association is on Facebook. We have the Facebook and a website. We're actually currently selling these hats.
Perfect.
For $20 to help us, like I said, maintain money into our fund so that we don't have to charge a membership fee. I bought 5 of these and I actually was giving them out to new anglers. Friend of mine, Jerry Maloney, that every year he reports fish recaptures. He's one of our fishermen that goes out. He puts his time in the trenches, and I actually got a hat for him. So, and I gave a couple to new anglers that were there. But one of the things that we didn't talk about was the mercury level in fish. The bigger fish have higher mercuries, and so that we're seeing. This is one of the reasons why we're trying to introduce a slot limit for smaller fish, because a bigger fish will have more mercury in it, higher than the acceptable level by Health Canada. A lot of people don't realize that. We actually were sitting in a meeting, and we were looking at that, and we want to make sure that just because a fish is big enough to take home or whatever, it doesn't mean you have to. We want to see this resource, like you said, for the fisheries, right? To have. Because just because you can take it, like I said, take it home, that 28-inch fish, 5, 6, 7 years down the road, could become that 48-inch fish that was tagged X amount of years ago. There's always that chance of recapture the fish of a lifetime, and if you keep it, it's never going to become that size. So, like I said, I'm advocate for catch and release. I mean, I have kept fish in the past, great tasting fish, but like I said, from a health standpoint, the bigger fish, you're going to have the more mercury. I think Lita, you guys done studies in that. The conservation group has done studies in that, and it's all holding true that the bigger fish have more mercury. And as you know, it's mercury is a toxic substance that it affects elderly, newborns, and all that. So this is something to think about from that perspective. So if Lita want to comment on that, more than welcome to.
Good point.
Yeah, and that's something too that in addition to just lengths and things, so if anglers are keeping bass too, we do take the carcasses for a number of other research pieces. So looking at diet and gonads, mercury, and otoliths. So if you even fillet the bass and want to just give us the rest, we take that for research as well. But please just don't leave it on our doorstep because it'll be pretty smelly.
Yeah, yeah.
That's Jackson Yang specialty.
Yeah.
Hopefully
So
we'll be back soon.
yeah. So yeah, I guess preferred method is like freeze it first, maybe, and then bring it in, probably.
Yep, freeze it, and then we'll come pick it up. Or even if you just caught it that day, and if we're available, then we'll just come to you and come pick it up.
Awesome. Well, it's been very interesting having you guys on. I know I learned a lot, and I'm happy that I did because I was feeding people incorrect information. So thank you guys for coming on and sharing your wealth of knowledge and your research. And I got to thank both of you for just the effort you put towards the conservation and study of these fish, because I really do think it's world class, and I really do think that pretty soon I can already see the popularity rising. Owen, I know we talked about it a lot, and I think that within a few years that Nova Scotia is going to be on the map for our striped bass fishery. So I think that the work you're doing is super important, super important, and I think that we all have to kind of put an effort into kind of conservation and really looking after taking care of these fish, because I think we got something special here for sure. So thanks guys for coming on, and if any of you out there watching, whether it's live right now or later on, this can be available on Ripple FX Cape Breton, Ripple FX Canada as soon as this live broadcast ends. If you're watching, be a part of it. Send the striped bass research team some information if you're out fishing, and look up Owen and the Striped Bass Association and get involved. Thank you guys, appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having us.
All right, you've been watching Fish On. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next time.